The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base cafeteria as Sarah Mitchell stood in line, her civilian clothes marking her as an outsider among the sea of uniforms. At 28, she carried herself with quiet confidence, though today she felt the weight of curious stares from the soldiers around her. Her appointment as the new Admiral wouldn't be announced until tomorrow, and for now, she was just another visitor navigating the complex world of military protocol. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual morning chatter. Soldiers discussed upcoming drills, weekend plans, and the rumors circulating about their new commanding officer. Sarah listened quietly, gathering insights into the base's culture and the challenges she would soon face. She had worked years for this moment, climbing through the ranks in naval intelligence, earning respect through dedication and strategic brilliance that had saved countless lives in covert operations. As she approached the beverage station, Sarah noticed the coffee was nearly empty. The hot milk dispenser, however, was full and steaming. She had always preferred milk with a touch of honey in the morning, a simple pleasure that reminded her of childhood breakfasts with her grandmother, who had taught her that strength came not from aggression, but from wisdom and patience. Behind her in line stood Corporal Jake Harrison, a 24-year-old soldier known for his quick temper and tendency to assert dominance over anyone he perceived as weak. Jake had been passed over for promotion twice, leaving him bitter and eager to prove his worth through displays of power. His friends often encouraged his behavior, mistaking cruelty for strength. Jake watched Sarah with growing irritation. Her calm demeanor and civilian clothes triggered something in him, a need to establish his place in the military hierarchy. He had seen too many outsiders come through the base, consultants and officials who didn't understand what real soldiers endured. In his mind, this woman represented everything soft about the world outside their harsh military reality. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jake said, his voice carrying a mocking tone that made several nearby soldiers turn their heads. "I think you're lost. The civilian tour doesn't start for another hour." Sarah turned slowly, meeting his gaze with steady eyes. She had encountered this type of behavior before, soldiers who confused rank with worth, who believed intimidation was leadership. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied quietly, her voice carrying an authority that Jake failed to recognize. The interaction drew more attention. Other soldiers began to circle around, some curious, others sensing the potential for entertainment. Jake felt the pressure of their watching eyes and decided to escalate the situation. He had an audience now, and backing down would mean losing face in front of his peers. "Well then, maybe you need some military discipline," Jake sneered, reaching for the hot milk dispenser. "Let me help you understand how things work around here." What happened next would be talked about for weeks throughout the base. Jake deliberately overfilled Sarah's cup, letting the scalding milk overflow onto her hands and splash across her blouse. The hot liquid left red marks on her skin and stained her carefully chosen outfit, clothes she had selected for tomorrow's introduction ceremony. The cafeteria fell silent except for a few nervous chuckles from Jake's supporters. Sarah stood motionless for a moment, feeling the burn of the milk and the deeper sting of public humiliation. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the effort of controlling her response. Every instinct told her to reveal her identity, to watch Jake's face crumble when he realized what he had done, but she held back. "Feel free to clean that up," Jake said, tossing a handful of napkins at her feet. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before wandering into places you don't belong." Sarah looked down at the napkins scattered around her shoes, then back at Jake's smirking face. The cafeteria watched in tense silence as she slowly knelt and began picking up the napkins, using them to dab at the milk stains on her clothes. Her movements were deliberate, dignified, refusing to give Jake the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. As she stood up, Sarah's eyes swept across the gathered crowd. She memorized faces, those who had laughed, those who had looked away in shame, and those who had watched with obvious discomfort at Jake's behavior. Leadership, she knew, meant understanding the character of those under your command, and this moment had revealed more about her future subordinates than any formal briefing could have provided. "Thank you for the lesson," Sarah said quietly, her words carrying a weight that Jake was too arrogant to interpret correctly. She turned and walked away, leaving behind a cafeteria full of soldiers who had just witnessed what they believed was the humiliation of a helpless civilian. Jake basked in the attention, accepting congratulations from his friends who praised him for putting the outsider in her place. He spent the rest of the day retelling the story, each version becoming more exaggerated, more heroic in his portrayal of events. He had no idea that he had just humiliated the woman who would soon hold his military career in her hands. Meanwhile, Sarah returned to her temporary quarters to change clothes and tend to her burned hands. As she looked in the mirror, she saw not a victim, but a commander who had just learned valuable lessons about the culture she was inheriting. The incident had shown her which soldiers followed blindly, which ones possessed moral courage, and which ones confused cruelty with strength. She opened her briefing files and began making notes. Tomorrow's introduction ceremony would be just the beginning. Real change would require patience, strategy, and the kind of wisdom her grandmother had taught her years ago. Some lessons, Sarah knew, were best learned through experience rather than lectures. As evening approached, Sarah walked the base perimeter alone, observing the daily routines and interactions between soldiers. She watched Jake and his friends at the outdoor training area, noting how their behavior influenced younger recruits. The pattern was clear: toxic leadership creating toxic culture, one small cruelty at a time. But Sarah also observed positive examples. She saw senior non-commissioned officers mentoring new recruits with patience and respect. She watched soldiers helping each other through difficult training exercises, sharing equipment and knowledge without being asked. The base wasn't broken. It simply had some broken leaders who needed to be addressed. That night, Sarah sat at her desk reviewing personnel files by lamplight. Jake Harrison's record showed a pattern of disciplinary issues, missed promotions, and complaints from fellow soldiers. Yet he had also shown bravery in combat situations, suggesting that his behavior stemmed from misdirected energy rather than true malice. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would shake the foundation of assumptions throughout the base. But tonight, Sarah Mitchell prepared for the challenge of transforming not just Jake, but an entire military culture that had allowed such behavior to flourish. The hot milk had stained her clothes, but it had also illuminated the path forward. As she turned off the light and prepared for sleep, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Jake Harrison had taught her something valuable today. He had shown her exactly what kind of leader she needed to become. Tomorrow, she would begin returning that favor. The assembly hall buzzed with anticipation as soldiers filled every seat, their crisp uniforms reflecting the importance of the morning's ceremony. Word had spread throughout the base that their new admiral would be introduced today, though speculation about the mysterious leader's identity had run wild for weeks. Some expected a grizzled veteran with decades of combat experience. Others whispered about a political appointee from Washington. Jake Harrison sat in the third row with his squad, still riding high from yesterday's incident. He had retold the story of humiliating the civilian woman at least a dozen times, each retelling adding embellishments that painted him as the defender of military honor. His friends encouraged the narrative, laughing at his imitation of the woman's shocked expression when the hot milk splashed across her clothes. "I bet she learned her lesson about wandering where she doesn't belong," Jake whispered to his buddy, who nodded approvingly. "Civilians need to understand that we don't play games here." The base's senior staff filed onto the stage, their polished boots clicking against the wooden floor in perfect synchronization. Colonel, the interim commander, approached the podium with a folder containing the new admiral's introduction. Behind him, a curtained section of the stage concealed the incoming leader from view. "Soldiers," Colonel's voice boomed across the hall, instantly silencing all conversation. "Today marks a new chapter in our base's distinguished history. We welcome a leader whose service record speaks of exceptional courage, strategic brilliance, and unwavering dedication to protecting our nation's interests." Jake shifted in his seat, mildly curious but mostly focused on the lunch plans he was making with his squad. The ceremony felt like another boring military formality, something to endure before getting back to real soldier work. He had no idea that his world was about to shatter completely. "Admiral Sarah Mitchell has served our country with distinction for over 15 years, Colonel continued, his voice carrying genuine respect. Her leadership in covert operations has saved countless lives and prevented international incidents that could have destabilized entire regions. She comes to us from naval intelligence, where she earned a reputation for transforming dysfunctional units into models of military excellence." The name meant nothing to Jake, but around the hall, several senior officers straightened in their seats with recognition. Sarah Mitchell's reputation in intelligence circles was legendary, a brilliant strategist who had outmaneuvered enemy operatives in situations where conventional military tactics would have failed catastrophically. Colonel gestured toward the curtained area. "It is my honor to introduce Admiral Sarah Mitchell, your new commanding officer." The curtains parted, and Sarah Mitchell stepped forward into the spotlight. The effect on the assembly hall was immediate and dramatic. A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd as hundreds of soldiers processed what they were seeing. Jake's mouth fell open in shock, his face draining of color as recognition hit him like a physical blow. It was her, the woman from yesterday. The civilian he had humiliated with hot milk was now standing before them in full Admiral's dress uniform, her chest decorated with ribbons and medals that spoke of service and sacrifice beyond anything Jake had ever imagined. The insignia on her shoulders carried the weight of authority that could make or break military careers with a single decision. Sarah stood calmly at the podium, her presence commanding despite her relatively small stature. She had chosen to wear her dress uniform for this moment, knowing that the visible symbols of rank would drive home the reality of what Jake and his supporters had done. The burn marks on her hands, hidden beneath white gloves, served as a private reminder of yesterday's lesson. "Good morning," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall without need for amplification. "Yesterday, I had the opportunity to observe this base from a unique perspective, as an outsider looking in. What I saw taught me valuable lessons about the culture we will be working together to build." Jake felt his stomach drop as her eyes swept across the crowd. He prayed that she wouldn't remember him among the sea of faces, that somehow he might escape notice and consequences. Around him, his friends began to shift uncomfortably as they too realized the magnitude of their situation. "Military service demands excellence not just in combat, but in character," Sarah continued. "We are entrusted with protecting not only our nation's security, but also the values that make our nation worth defending. Honor, integrity, and respect for human dignity are not suggestions. They are the foundation upon which all military discipline must stand." The hall remained absolutely silent, except for the occasional shuffling of feet or clearing of throats. Senior officers in the front rows nodded approvingly, recognizing the tone of a leader who intended to make significant changes. They had seen Sarah's preliminary assessment report and knew that she had already identified several areas requiring immediate attention. Sarah's gaze settled briefly on Jake's section before moving on, but that moment of eye contact felt like an eternity to the young corporal. He saw no anger in her expression, no desire for revenge, just the steady assessment of a commander evaluating her troops. Somehow, that made it worse than if she had glared at him with obvious fury. "Some of you may be wondering about my qualifications to lead this base," Sarah said, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "It's natural to have questions about any new commanding officer. I believe in earning respect through actions rather than demanding it through rank alone." She clicked a remote, and a large screen descended behind her, displaying a map of the Middle East with several locations highlighted in red. 3 years ago, a joint operation in Syria faced catastrophic failure when our embedded team was discovered by enemy forces. The conventional response would have been a rescue mission that would have likely resulted in an international incident and the loss of American lives. The screen showed classified photographs of a desert compound surrounded by hostile forces. Jake found himself drawn into the story despite his personal terror, unable to look away from the evidence of real military action far beyond anything he had experienced. Instead, our team implemented a psychological operation that convinced the enemy forces they were being targeted by a rival faction. Within 12 hours, they had evacuated the compound and released our personnel, believing they were protecting themselves from a threat that existed only in their minds. Murmurs of appreciation rippled through the crowd. This was the kind of strategic thinking that separated exceptional leaders from ordinary ones, the ability to win without fighting, to achieve objectives through intelligence rather than brute force. The operation saved 17 American lives and prevented a diplomatic crisis that could have destabilized peace negotiations throughout the region, Sarah concluded as the screen retracted. More importantly, it demonstrated that true strength comes not from the ability to overpower others, but from the wisdom to find better solutions. Jake felt the weight of her words like physical pressure on his chest. Every sentence seemed directed at him, though she hadn't once looked in his direction or mentioned yesterday's incident. The message was clear without being explicit. True military leaders didn't need to humiliate others to prove their worth. "I want to address something directly," Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. "Military culture has sometimes confused aggression with strength, dominance with leadership. We've all seen examples of soldiers who believe that intimidating others makes them powerful. This attitude doesn't just harm unit cohesion, it makes us weaker as a fighting force." The silence in the hall became even more profound. Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as he waited for her to expose yesterday's incident to the entire base. His military career, his reputation, everything he had worked for hung in the balance of her next words. Instead, Sarah shifted topics. "I believe in second chances. I believe that good soldiers can sometimes make poor choices, and that leadership means helping people become the best versions of themselves. But I also believe in accountability. Actions have consequences, and those consequences must be proportional to both the action and the individual's willingness to learn from their mistakes." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Over the next few weeks, I'll be conducting individual meetings with personnel throughout the base. These conversations will help me understand our strengths, identify areas for improvement, and ensure that every soldier understands their role in our mission." Jake's hands began to tremble slightly as he imagined that inevitable meeting. Would she destroy him publicly, court-martial him for assaulting a superior officer, or would she choose a more subtle form of justice that would end his career just as effectively? "Before we conclude," Sarah said, returning to the podium after walking across the stage, "I want to share something my grandmother taught me when I was young. She used to say that how we treat people when we think no one important is watching reveals our true character. Military service gives us power, power over subordinates, power over resources, power over life and death decisions. The measure of our worth isn't how we exercise that power when it serves our interests, but how we restrain it when restraint serves justice." The ceremony concluded with the traditional honors, but Jake barely registered the procedural formalities. As soldiers began filing out of the hall, he remained seated, staring at the empty stage where his fate had been sealed. His friends patted his shoulder sympathetically, finally understanding the gravity of what had happened. "You're screwed, man," whispered. "I mean really screwed. She's going to destroy you." But Jake was beginning to realize something that surprised him. As terrifying as his situation was, Sarah Mitchell had just demonstrated something he had never seen in a commanding officer before. She had had every right to humiliate him publicly, to expose his behavior and make an example of him in front of the entire base. Instead, she had chosen restraint. The lesson was beginning to penetrate his consciousness, though he didn't fully understand it yet. True power didn't need to destroy enemies to prove itself. True leadership meant choosing the path that served justice rather than personal satisfaction. As Jake finally stood to leave, he caught a glimpse of Admiral Mitchell speaking quietly with senior staff members near the stage. She looked up at that moment, and their eyes met briefly across the emptying hall. She nodded once, not threateningly, not mockingly, but with the acknowledgement that his education was about to begin. 3 weeks passed before Jake received the summons to Admiral Mitchell's office. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, imagined conversations, and growing dread that consumed his every waking moment. His performance in training had suffered as his mind constantly replayed the cafeteria incident and tried to predict his punishment. His friends had grown tired of his anxiety, alternating between reassurance and frustrated suggestions that he just get it over with. The Admiral's office occupied the corner of the administrative building, its large windows overlooking the parade ground where soldiers conducted their daily drills. Jake stood outside the heavy oak door for several minutes, gathering courage before finally knocking. "Enter," came the calm voice he remembered so well. Sarah Mitchell sat behind a modest desk that was notably free of the ego-driven decorations many commanders used to intimidate visitors. No walls covered with photos of herself with politicians or celebrities, no intimidating displays of weapons or trophies. Instead, the office contained books on military strategy, leadership philosophy, and psychological warfare. A single personal photo showed an elderly woman in a garden, presumably the grandmother she had mentioned in her speech. "Corporal Harrison, please sit down," Sarah said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk. She was reviewing a thick folder that Jake assumed contained his personnel file, disciplinary record, and probably detailed reports about the cafeteria incident. Jake sat stiffly, his dress uniform freshly pressed, but unable to hide his obvious nervousness. He had rehearsed various apologies, excuses, and explanations during the sleepless nights, but now found himself unable to speak as Sarah continued reading his file. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Sarah closed the folder and looked directly at him. Her expression was neither angry nor sympathetic, just professionally assessing, like a surgeon examining a patient before determining the best course of treatment. "Do you know why I waited 3 weeks to call you in here?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Jake replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I wanted to see what you would do with the knowledge of what you had done," Sarah explained. "I wanted to observe whether you would learn from the experience or simply worry about the consequences. I wanted to understand whether you were a soldier worth investing in or a problem that needed to be eliminated from this unit." Jake felt his mouth go dry. The idea that she had been watching him, evaluating him, for weeks without his knowledge was somehow more unsettling than any immediate punishment would have been. Sarah opened a different folder and spread several documents across her desk. "These are reports from your squad leaders, training instructors, and fellow soldiers from the past 3 weeks. Would you like to know what they say?" "I'm not sure, ma'am," Jake answered honestly. "They describe a soldier who has been distracted, anxious, and performing below his usual standards," Sarah said, reading from one report. "But they also describe someone who has stopped engaging in the kind of behavior that characterized him before our encounter. No more bullying of junior soldiers. No more inappropriate jokes or comments. No more attempts to establish dominance through intimidation." Jake looked up in surprise. He hadn't consciously changed his behavior. The transformation had happened gradually as he spent time thinking about Admiral Mitchell's words and his own actions. "Do you know what that tells me, Corporal?" Sarah continued. "No, ma'am. It tells me that you have a conscience. It tells me that you're capable of self-reflection and growth. Most importantly, it tells me that your previous behavior wasn't born from malice, but from poor examples and misguided ideas about what it means to be strong." Sarah stood up and walked to the window overlooking the parade ground. Jake could see soldiers going through their training routines, some struggling with difficult exercises, others helping their teammates overcome obstacles. "I've spent considerable time reviewing your record," Sarah said without turning around. "You scored in the top 10% on your entrance exams. Your marksmanship scores are excellent. In your one deployment, you showed genuine courage under fire and helped evacuate wounded civilians despite enemy fire. You have the potential to be an exceptional soldier and leader." "Then why do I keep screwing up?" Jake asked, the question bursting out before he could stop himself. Sarah turned back to him with what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Because no one ever taught you the difference between strength and cruelty, between leadership and dominance. Because you've been surrounded by examples of people who confused fear with respect." She returned to her desk and pulled out a different file. "I'm going to give you a choice, Corporal Harrison. I could pursue disciplinary action for your behavior in the cafeteria. Assault on a superior officer, conduct unbecoming, creating a hostile environment. Any of these charges would end your military career and possibly result in criminal prosecution." Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as the reality of his situation crystallized. "Or," Sarah continued, "you can accept assignment to a special leadership development program. It will be challenging, demanding, and will require you to confront some uncomfortable truths about yourself and your behavior. But if you complete it successfully, you'll emerge as the kind of leader this military needs." The offer was so unexpected that Jake couldn't immediately process it. He had expected punishment, humiliation, or dismissal, not an opportunity for redemption. "What would the program involve?" he asked cautiously. 6 months of intensive leadership training," Sarah explained. "You'll study military history, leadership psychology, and conflict resolution. You'll mentor new recruits under supervision. You'll work with military counselors to understand the roots of aggressive behavior and develop healthier ways to assert authority. Most challenging of all, you'll be required to make amends for your past behavior, not through empty apologies, but through sustained actions that demonstrate genuine change." Jake stared at the documents spread across her desk, his mind racing through the implications. 6 months of intense scrutiny, psychological evaluation, and personal confrontation with his worst impulses. It would be easier to simply accept punishment and move on with his life, but something in Admiral Mitchell's steady gaze told him this was a one-time offer. "Why are you doing this for me?" Jake asked. "After what I did to you, why would you invest time and resources in helping me become better?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer carefully. "Because 3 weeks ago, I watched a young soldier make a terrible choice based on poor examples and misguided ideas about strength. But I also saw someone who was capable of recognizing his mistake and beginning to change his behavior without being forced to do so. That suggests character worth developing." She leaned forward, her voice becoming more personal. "Also because my grandmother taught me that true strength lies in helping others become their best selves, not in destroying them when they show their worst selves. The hot milk you threw on me burned my skin, but it also illuminated an opportunity to make a real difference in a soldier's life." Jake felt something breaking open in his chest, a knot of anger and defensiveness that had been there for years, slowly dissolving under the weight of unexpected grace. "What if I fail the program?" "Then you fail," Sarah said simply. "But failure after genuine effort is different from failure due to lack of opportunity. I can live with giving you a chance and having you waste it. I cannot live with destroying a potentially good soldier without first attempting to help him become one." The silence stretched between them as Jake wrestled with the decision. Everything in his old way of thinking told him to reject the offer, to maintain his pride and face whatever punishment came his way. But a newer voice, one that had been growing stronger over the past 3 weeks, recognized this as exactly the kind of second chance he had never expected to receive. "I accept," Jake said quietly. "I accept the program." Sarah nodded and pulled out a thick packet of materials. "The program begins Monday. You'll report to Dr. Elizabeth in the counseling department at 800. Your training schedule is outlined here, along with reading assignments and evaluation criteria." As Jake reached for the packet, Sarah's hand briefly touched his. "Corporal Harrison, this program will require you to confront parts of yourself that you may not want to acknowledge. It will ask you to admit mistakes, show vulnerability, and sometimes look weak in front of others. Are you prepared for that kind of challenge?" "I think so, ma'am. I hope so." "Good, because real strength, the kind that makes great leaders and great soldiers, requires the courage to be vulnerable, the wisdom to admit ignorance, and the humility to keep learning from everyone around you." 6 months later, Jake Harrison stood before a new group of recruits as a newly promoted sergeant. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been moments of frustration, setbacks, and painful realizations about the harm his previous behavior had caused. But under the careful guidance of Admiral Mitchell's leadership development program, he had learned to channel his natural intensity into positive leadership rather than destructive dominance. The recruits before him came from diverse backgrounds, some confident to the point of arrogance, others scared and uncertain about their decision to join the military. Jake recognized younger versions of himself in several faces and felt a responsibility to give them better examples than he had received. "Military service is about more than following orders or winning fights," Jake began, his voice carrying an authority born from hard-won wisdom rather than inherited aggression. "It's about becoming the kind of person who can protect others not just through strength, but through character." In the back of the training room, Admiral Mitchell observed quietly, taking notes for her evaluation reports. She had watched Jake's transformation with professional satisfaction and personal pride, knowing that his success would inspire other soldiers to believe in their own capacity for growth. After the training session, Jake approached her with obvious nervousness still present despite months of progress. "Admiral, I wanted to thank you again for the opportunity you gave me. I know I didn't deserve it." "Sergeant Harrison," Sarah replied, using his new rank, "you didn't deserve punishment either. You deserved guidance, which is what leadership should provide. Your success in this program hasn't just changed your life, it's changed the lives of every soldier you'll now lead properly." As they walked together across the parade ground, Jake reflected on the journey that had begun with hot milk and humiliation. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead." "Were you ever tempted to just destroy me, to make an example of me in front of everyone?" Sarah smiled, the same patient expression she had worn that day in the cafeteria. "Of course. My first instinct was to humiliate you the way you had humiliated me. But my grandmother taught me that revenge feels satisfying for a moment, while justice creates positive change that lasts for years. You've proven which choice serves the greater good. The base around them buzzed with activity. Soldiers training, learning, growing into the protectors their country needed them to become. What had started as a moment of cruelty had transformed into a model of redemption that would influence military culture for years to come. Jake Harrison had learned that true strength meant lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Admiral Sarah Mitchell had learned that sometimes the most important victories happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when leaders choose grace over vengeance, development over destruction. The hot milk had long since been forgotten, but the lessons it taught continued to spread throughout the base, one transformed soldier at a time.